Bizarre mummification practices from around the world. Most people know about mummies in ancient Egypt, and have maybe even seen one or two in a museum. We know the traditions involving sarcophagi, elaborate tombs, and how mummies were made in the days of the pharaohs, but most people don't know that mummification practices aren't just confined to ancient Egypt. Mummies have been mummifying while they were still alive. Usually mummification starts after you die. For some Buddhist monks, however, the process began years before you actually passed away. These monks believed the path to immortality began by eating nothing but nuts and seeds, and exercising vigorously to rid themselves of all body fat. Then, after 3 years, they would drink a poisonous tea that would cause them to violently purge themselves, removing moisture from inside their bodies while also killing off any internal parasites that might otherwise rot their flesh. At last, they would wall themselves into a small, closed-off stone tomb, assume the lotus position, and simply wait to die, ringing a bell each day to let people outside know they were still alive. When the bell stopped ringing, everyone knew the monk inside was dead and the mummification process was complete. Unfortunately, most who attempted this ritual were not successful, as open tombs have revealed. Their corpses showed signs of decay. However, the bodies of those who achieved their goal were removed, put on display, and venerated. Painted corpses in their own body fat. The indigenous people of the Torres Straits and neighboring islands had a particularly gruesome mummification process. First, the bodies were tattooed elaborately, often with stripes. All body fat was carefully removed from the corpses. Then, all the body's orifices would be sewed shut, and their bodies smoked over a fire over the course of about 10 days. During that time, mourners stood guard over the corpse, shooing away flies. The mourners were not allowed to speak at all for the entire time it took to smoke the bodies. Once the bodies were dried, they were further decorated, and then the removed body fat was mixed with red ochre and painted back onto the body as a preservative. If you think that sounds horrifying, consider this slightly different practice in the region. Some Melanesian people would place a dead body into a canoe and push it out to sea. There, its skin was peeled away, and its organs removed and replaced with palm pith. Then the body was brought back to land and dried. The tongue, the palms of the hands, and the soles of the feet were removed and given to the deceased person's spouse. When the mummy was fully dried, it was painted and decorated with seashell eyes, grass, and seeds. The mummy was then tied to the center post of its former home. Dismember, then rebuild their dead. Mummies in the Chinchorro style, in northern Chile, are about as far from Egyptian mummies as you can get. For these mummies, the body itself isn't so much preserved as rebuilt from the ground up by a master craftsman. First, a dead person's skin was removed and their skull packed with straw and earth. The spine would be recreated and strengthened with wood or reeds, as would the rest of the bones. Body parts would be held together using glue made from eggs or sea lion blood.
The latest mummy appears to be an old man.
Then, with expert care, the artisan recreating the dead person would layer a thick coat of clay across the body, especially the face, and sculpt features on top of that, often creating a little O-shaped mouth for emphasis. Bodies would even get a wig. At last, the skin would be reattached when the process was finished. In other words, mummies made in this way were all about effort and precision, but many of them have lasted for thousands of years. Created Incan mummies out of sacrificial victims. Incan mummies were said to be pretty stunning, complete with hair, clothing, and jewelry, and were paraded by their people through the streets.
So long, but nothing had the impact of when we uncovered her hands. Probably one of the most
Tragically,
powerful
European colonizers thought this treatment of the dead was irreverent, and so many mummies were destroyed. Because of this, the process by which these mummies were made is still not fully understood. However, we do know that the Inca people used their natural surroundings to help them with the process. We know this because of several mummies found in a mountain burial site, all children, and all sacrificed in a ritual fashion. These children of Lalailaco, as they are called, were dressed in ceremonial clothing, surrounded by statues, gold, and other offerings. Their bodies had been naturally mummified by the cold and arid climate. We don't know if previous, now destroyed mummies were preserved in the same manner, but the intact hair, clothing, and facial features on the children do provide a lot of information on ancient Incan culture. Mummified remains of many communist leaders. Not all mummies are ancient. For example, Russia has a modern mummy of Vladimir Lenin. This communist revolutionary was preserved over 90 years ago, and is continually cared for, re-embalmed once a year, and displayed to this day in Moscow's Red Square. Such care has been taken in his embalming that his hair, eyelashes, fingernails, and facial expression have been nearly perfectly preserved. However, the exact methods used are still kept secret. More than a dozen other communist leaders have also been mummified, including Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh, and Mao Zedong, all still on view today in their countries of origin. Keep mummies as part of the family. Have you ever smoked meat to dry and preserve it? Well, that's the basic concept behind the mummies of Papua New Guinea. The art of mummification is still practiced among the Unga people, and important leaders and officials are smoked in a hut for 30 days, like meat, before being put in chairs, paraded, and then perched atop a cliff to look down on and watch over the village. Elders can go and sit with the mummies, ask them for advice, or just have a chat, and people continue to treat them like valued members of society. Mummies were preserved like jerky. The Kabayan mummies of the Philippines are also appropriately called fire mummies. We're not sure exactly when they were made, though we know it was sometime between 1200 and 1500 AD. Tribal leaders would be given a strongly salty drink to begin drying their bodies out moments before death. Then, after death, the leaders would be put in a seated position and set over a fire to dry them, and tobacco smoke was fed into their mouths to preserve them from the inside out, as well. Once they were all dry, their bodies were rubbed with herbs, then taken to a cave for their final rest. The whole process would take several weeks to complete. The Ibaloi tribe continued this practice until European colonizers in the 1500s forbade the practice of making mummies. Mummify tattooed heads as trophies. Although whole bodies were not generally mummified by the Maori people, the heads of chiefs and great enemies were preserved as mokamokai, or trophies. The heads were ornately tattooed, the brains were removed, and then they were boiled or steamed. Finally, they were dried and preserved for display. Sadly, the British who encountered these Maori tribes thought these heads were fascinating, and many were collected, or stolen for display elsewhere. Many mummified heads of great leaders are still the subject of legal disputes and are in the process of being returned to the indigenous people whose ancestors created them. A mummified little girl sleeps inside the catacombs. In 1920, a heartbroken father asked that his young daughter, Rosalia, be entombed in the Capuchin catacombs of Sicily. Embalmer Alfredo Salafia agreed to preserve the little girl for all eternity, and, just as he promised, she has remained intact for almost a century. The little girl still lies in a glass coffin, looking as if she's only sleeping, and can still be seen by visitors today. She was embalmed using formalin, zinc salt, alcohol, salicylic acid, and glycerin, all of which were helped by the dry climate inside the catacombs. If you want an extra creep factor for this little sleeping beauty, many tourists have reported that lighting tricks sometimes make it seem as though she blinks her eyes at them. Greenland's Inuit mummies. When a grave of 500-year-old mummies was unearthed in Greenland, It caused a stir not only because of how well the bodies were preserved, but because of the identities of the dead. The Inuit people had a habit of burying their dead in the icy earth, under rock and snow, in clothes meant to help them on a long journey. They did this in a way that allowed there to be space for air to circulate around the bodies, thus preserving them, as the mummies found in 1972 showed. Researchers were surprised to find that one of the mummies was an infant, only 6 months old. The baby had been buried alive with his deceased mother. We are still not sure why these people were buried and preserved this way. Let's show us your feeling about this video and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for your watching.